as those of us who are in Charlottesville know, the weather today is terrible. The weather is cold and windy, and it would not be a pleasant day to be driving into an office or to a lecture room. And it wouldn't be what Amitav and I had imagined when we planned a visit to Charlottesville in April. Most beautiful time in Charlottesville, but not today. So we'll have to have Amitav come back physically and give a presentation to us all so we can all enjoy the outside. But today we can enjoy the warmth and coziness of our insides. Amitav is a chaired professor at American University, and therefore he is in the Beltway, but he is not of the Beltway. He is a man of the globalized world. He was educated in India and Australia, and he's taught in Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, China, and most exotically, Canada, which is maybe the least understood of the places for an American. And he is the top scholar on the politics of the Association of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN and its member states. His forthcoming book, which should be out this month, right? Or very soon anyway, is on the title of today's lecture. So we will hear much more about the system of ASEAN and its contribution to regional politics. But also, I want to stress that his books on different topics are must-read books for anyone seriously interested in international relations. I would particularly recommend his book on the end of the American world order, which is a very frank and well-informed reflection on the transformations that have occurred in global politics and in the underlying dynamics of global politics over the last 20 years particularly. And also the book he co-authored with Barry Buzan on a critical interpretive history of international relations as a discipline. International relations as a discipline is often dated from the end of the First World War. So this is the 100th anniversary. And that book does an excellent job, not only of narrating the familiar names of international relations, and not just of scholars, but also scholar politicians like Woodrow Wilson, but also the global context and the interaction between very Western, first of all, Eurocentric, then American-centric international relations, academics, and the rest of the world. So besides today's talk, those things are of interest. Now, this semester, University of Virginia is paying special attention to Southeast Asia. Last month, we had a very nice conversation with Daniel Crittenbrink, ambassador to Vietnam until his term ended, his term is ending right at the present time, and an alumnus of UVA. And of course, Dan is now, I don't know whether it was because of his very successful rap or his reputation or his performance in Vietnam, but he is being promoted to Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific. And I think by all three counts, he'll be a worthy addition to the top levels of American diplomacy. Next week, on Thursday night, we will have the Vietnamese ambassador to the United States, Ha Kim Ngok, and he will be speaking on U.S.-Vietnamese relations. So it's sort of an encore performance from the other side of the diplomacy between the United States and Vietnam. And you will, if you haven't received an announcement about this, you probably will. And in any case, you can check the East Asia Center website for information and for the registration link. Now, it's not just UVA that's taking the greater interest in Southeast Asia, and I hope that it continues here. But the United States seems to be spending more time on Southeast Asia than it has in the past. But interest does not necessarily imply understanding. If you remember, Columbus' discovery of the New World led to many people being mislabeled as Indians. And the last time the US was seriously engaged in Southeast Asia, we found Indian territory there as well. The core reason for our failure in the area was that we derived our politics from a Cold War mentality of containment and dominoes. Now, Southeast Asia is a successful and diverse region, and it deserves our respect. And part of our respect to the region should be our respect for the top scholar of the region, Amitav Acharya. Let me just say, for question and answers, please hold your questions till the end. We won't address the questions till the end of Amitav's talk. And please do not choose the anonymous option for your questions, because we'd like to know who you are. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Amitav. Thank you.
Good morning and good evening to those of you who are listening from Asia or other parts of the world. And thank you, Brantley. Thank you, Dorothy, for inviting me to this webinar today. And thank you, Brian Murphy, for organizing the logistics. Yes, I would love to have been giving this talk in your beautiful campus, and I was really looking forward to it, but unfortunately, that's not going to happen for some time. However, another place that I really miss very much really is Southeast Asia. And as you can imagine, I spent 12 years of my professional career there. I started my first job in the region in Singapore, but I've traveled all over the region and written about it. So it's been really difficult not to get there in person for the past year and a half. And well, the best thing I can do is to have mementos and images and pictures from the region. So if you can look at my backdrop, you will see a couple of them. The first one is, of course, a painting of Borobudur, handcrafted and hand-painted in silk. But the one to well, I guess you'll be to your left and my right, is a puppet. And that's very meaningful to me. That meaningful is because this is the puppet I got for giving a lecture, free lecture, at the Mandalay Puppet Theater when I was last in Myanmar teaching a course at Mandalay University. I've taught both at Yangon University and Mandalay University. And this was my last visit to Myanmar in 2016. And not last visit to Myanmar, but to teach there. I've been there since as well. And so I was just walking by this puppet theater, the Mandalay Puppet Theater, and somebody recognized me on the street. And I said, "Oh, Professor, I have been listening to your lecture at Mandalay University." And he happened to be a student there. "And would you like to come in?" So when I went in, he said, I was introduced to the owner of the theater, and a lady. She said, "Professor, if you would like to give a lecture to our puppet, well, our audience, and if you do that, we would also like to invite you to a free puppet show." So that's what I did. And that's the puppet I got as my wage. But it was a good, I guess, good thing to start with this because, as you know, Myanmar is going through a very rough time. And I'd like to show you my lecture to the puppet theater. And one of the puppets hanging there is what I got. And this was given, I asked them for the best puppet they had, and it was made by the owner herself. Actually, her husband was actually making the puppet themselves. So they said, "You have a choice." And I got that one. But it's a very painful memory now, considering what's going on there. And I had predicted that. I'll tell you how. I predicted that Myanmar will go through a military control again last year because the situation was not good. And that was even before the elections. But this is now not only a tragic event in the history of Myanmar, but it's very tragic for ASEAN as well. The topic of my talk today is that this is one of the frontal challenges to ASEAN, how to deal with the situation in Myanmar without, say, losing face, credibility before the world, and while keeping its internal unity and cohesion well intact, or at least preserving it to the best possible degree. So with that kind of a somber note, let me give you the outline of my new book. And this seminar, as you have heard, I've seen from the flyer, it's really like a book talk. And it draws directly from my book, Revisiting a Security Community in Southeast Asia, and the title being the ASEAN and Regional Order. So this is how it started. This year, 2021, is the 20th anniversary of the first edition of this book called Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia. That was 2001. And I was actually at that time traveling between Toronto, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was actually teaching a course with the late Ezra Vogel at Harvard. And then I moved to Singapore at the middle of 2001 to start a new job there. And I ended up spending 7 years there. That was the 7 of my 12 years in Singapore, because I had spent another 5 years in the 1990s. 1980s as well, 87, my first job, 87 to 89. A lot of good memories, and based on my research for almost like 10 years, 1987 to, well, when the 2001 was, the book was published, it was already in press for a year or 7 months. So about over 10 years of research, I wrote this book. And a book was immediately very popular. It was blessed by the legendary Michael Leifer. Michael Leifer was the doyen of Southeast Asian international relations. Very fond of him, although we didn't agree. My book is called Constructing. It's a constructivist book focusing on ideas, norms, and identity. Michael was, I guess for the lack of a better word, more of a realist, although he was more like a classical realist. And but we have a lot in common in terms of looking at the region from a critical eye, from a different theoretical framing, but with a critical eye, both liking the region, but also understanding its issues and problems, never being starry-eyed or ignoring or whistling away the difficulties the region faced. So the 2001 book on ASEAN was kind of outcome of that. I also have another book called The Making of Southeast Asia, which was much more historical, goes and much more beyond ASEAN. But I thought ASEAN deserved credit because it was, at that time at least, not recognized by scholars who study comparative regionalism in the West. The field of regional organization studies, or what we call comparative regionalism, is very Eurocentric. It revolves around the European Union, at least until recently. And groups like African Union, or Organization of African Unity, or especially ASEAN, which was actually, to me, very credible given all the limitations of its circumstances. They didn't really get much mention, much analysis, much space in this theoretical literature on comparative regionalism. Moreover, the literature on ASEAN that we had before was very either atheoretical or semi-theoretical, for a good reason. A lot of the people who wrote on ASEAN are area specialists, or were area specialists. And they looked at Southeast Asia on its own terms, not in terms of some theory, especially Western theories that came from European regionalism or European Union. So the literature on ASEAN was very theoretical. It's changed quite a bit. And I must say that this book was one of the very first explicitly theory-driven or theory-guided books on ASEAN. And it has done very well in that context. It has been read and used widely, not only by Southeast Asian studies students, but also a lot of international relations students, IR students. It has over 2,000 citations in Google Scholar, which is one of the benchmarks of its appeal. But more importantly, it has gone through many editions. So this 2009, the second edition, it got bigger. Then 2014, it got really bigger. So the publishers decided to turn it into a textbook format, much wider and without cutting any earlier stuff. And then in 2021, I decided I don't want to do a new edition because it's very painful to edit your own stuff written even 5 years ago. I decided to write an entirely new book, a short book, but with the same publisher, which is Routledge, Taylor and Francis, and basically cover the events from 2014 to 2021, or 2020, well, just around December 2020. And by doing so, we sort of maintain a continuity with the earlier books. The argument remains the same. I do have one chapter in 2021, the new book, which summarizes ASEAN's history, drawing on the material from the 3 editions. But then the rest of it is much more up to date. But as you can tell, there is no such thing as up to date in international relations. So what happens today, is very different from what we had anticipated 5 months ago, or even 1 month ago, and certainly 1 year ago, where nobody actually thought the pandemic would take on such a global proportions. The pandemic was already around, but we did not quite have the grasp of our sense of how widespread and how deadly it will be. Certainly, nobody would have imagined that the most powerful country on earth, the United States of America, will lose 500,000, more than 500,000, and counting. Around this time last year, that he will end up infecting some 30 million Americans. So it is really unprecedented in its scope, and also tells you how unpredictable international relations is. So what I'm talking about is already under challenge, especially the coup in Myanmar, although I did very well on that Myanmar coup, I would think, by saying very clearly in the last edition of the book, in the manuscript of the book, I want to show you that. And this is what I wrote in the book's manuscript in 2020, September. One cannot rule out a dramatic reversal of the already fragile democratization process in Myanmar, resulting in the military's return to power or control. And when the coup actually happened, I just tweeted, and I had the proof of the manuscript going through. So I just made a very simple correction to the original text that as happened in February 2021, because that's pretty much what I had thought about. And this is before the elections, by the way, which has been blamed on, the military claims that the elections were unfair, rigged, a little bit like, not a little bit, quite like what Trump has been saying about the US presidential elections that got us Joe Biden. And Trump still talks about how the elections are rigged without any proof. And the Myanmar military might have got a clue from Trump, and I'm sure it was something like that. So they basically make the claim that they have to take over because the election wasn't fair. But there was when I wrote this, there were already quite a number of indications the military is going to be very restive about its hold on power. But that's another story, and I'll be happy to answer questions on Myanmar too for all of you. Let me just go back to the topic of ASEAN, and I don't have a lot of time to go through all my slides, But just to tell you that this is the history of this book. This is Southeast Asia and ASEAN in Southeast Asia. This is ASEAN in Asia, you know, where its geographic location, those of you who are not familiar with ASEAN. So, you know, two countries that loom very large on ASEAN's destiny, or ASEAN's past and future, are India and China, partly because of location and geographic and cultural and political influences, but also ASEAN's strategic location in connecting the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal, and then the straits of Southeast Asia, like Straits of Malacca, to South China Sea and the Pacific, which is one reason why ASEAN is so strategically important to this world. But those things are geographic issues that many of you are familiar with. I want to talk about very quick like Professor Alice Bob and others have Professor Michael Leifer, of course, before he passed away around 2000. He has done wonderful work. Professor Sheldon Simon from United States, also a very significant ASEAN scholar. So I am telling the story. I don't want to go into details about this, but one thing I did was I did a lot of archival work, which other books didn't. I actually looked at ASEAN's, the British archives. The British were following ASEAN very closely. When it was formed, they were still 1967, before the East of Suez. And the Americans had basically left it to the British to pay attention to the politics of at least island Southeast Asia, outside of Indochina. The United States was still engaged in a war in Indochina, but they are starting to think about possible withdrawal from Indochina. But the British were closely monitoring ASEAN, and there are a lot of documents that I found very useful. But I was very fortunate to interview many of the surviving founders of ASEAN, people who actually participated in the making of ASEAN, including the foreign minister of Singapore, one of the founding fathers of ASEAN, sitting here to the right. I was able to talk to them. Tan Sri Ghazali Shafi, the Malaysian foreign minister, who was also present at ASEAN, not as a foreign minister at that time, but he certainly was one of the participants as a senior civil servant in the foreign ministry. Many Indonesian leaders, including generals. Indonesia was still under military rule at that time, and who were present in ASEAN's creation. From Singapore as well, Philippines. So I was very fortunate in having detailed interviews about ASEAN's formation and evolution, which gives the books a very authentic flavor, because I was able to draw on that. So based on that and recent developments, I think ASEAN gone through 5 stages. Welcome, I invite you to read the book. But the key thing is that there was no guarantee that ASEAN will survive when it was created. And that's the key point I like you to keep in mind. In fact, pessimism from the West, but also within ASEAN, among the ASEAN's founders, there was the 5 countries that founded ASEAN, namely Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. In '67, there were a lot of pessimism about ASEAN, which was exacerbated by conflicts between Malaysia and Philippines over Sabah, and Singapore and Indonesia over issues of military issues, military competition, and Malaysia and Singapore, the bitterness of Singapore's separation from Malaysia. And there was also kind of a pessimism coming from the fact that there's a bunch of very small, weak states, small not in the sense of physical size. Indonesia is, of course, a very big state, but as a small powers in the geopolitical sense, and surrounded by big nations, big powers like India and China historically, but the United States, the behemoth, still fighting a big war in Vietnam, and also the Soviet Union, which is competing with United States. So as a kind of pawns in the Cold War, as a relative, no ASEAN country is a great power. So they were very pessimistic about their survival and also their ability to do things. There was no question of an ASEAN free trade area, not to mention an ASEAN economic union, or now ASEAN economic community. Now it's a reality. There was no question about ASEAN being central. We hear so much about ASEAN's centrality these days in Asia-Pacific security debates. Well, nobody thought ASEAN would be central even to Southeast Asia, not to mention in the wider Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. Nobody would have thought an American president will travel to BNTN, or actually Obama went to Yangon, to those places, to attend a summit hosted by, a multilateral summit hosted by ASEAN states. So this is all very, very new product of, I guess, that after the Cold War period, and I discussed that. So I also argued that after the survival phase and stagnation phase was overcome, and that took a little bit until 1979, where the Vietnam invasion of Cambodia and a decade-long occupation of Cambodia began. That was the pessimism. ASEAN did a few things, like the first summit of ASEAN in Bali. This is the ASEAN summit in Bali with the 5 leaders, starting from the left with President Suharto, followed by Marcos, followed by Lee Kuan Yew, Tun Razak, Malaysia, the Thai Prime Minister, Thaksin Pramoj, and Tun Razak of Malaysia. This is the first ASEAN summit, 1976. That was quite important. But still, 76, well, the United States just has withdrawn from Vietnam. Britain has withdrawn from east of Suez. So ASEAN country, China was very, very assertive. You know, you talk about China being assertive. Today, you haven't, you should remember what happened before the 1970s, in the 50s and 60s. China was supporting every communist movement, fighting every ASEAN member country to overthrow every ASEAN member country from the 50s and 60s. It didn't stop until 1970s. So China has always loomed very large as a security challenge for ASEAN. So at that time, there was not much confidence before 1979. But ironically, it was because of the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, it's actually started, Christmas invasion, 1978, but really the effects would be known from early 79 onwards. And from there to its occupation of the country till September 1989. Those are the times when ASEAN actually managed to use the crisis into an opportunity, build confidence through conflict by offering to mediate, negotiate a political solution to the Cambodia conflict. And that was significant because people forget that at least in the early 70s, the West was not interested in solving the Cambodia conflict because it was a good way. This is the Reagan period. And President Reagan's Reagan doctrine, which is to bleed the Soviet Union dry by going to every place where Soviet Union or its allies have intervened, and then providing help to the resistance, so-called resistance to the Soviet or Soviet allied occupation, so that Soviet Union will be forced to provide more and more aid to maintain the occupation, in this case of that of Cambodia, but Afghanistan was similar. The Mujahideen, the US supported the Mujahideen to bleed the Soviet Union directly in there. Here, bleed Vietnamese, but Soviet Union was giving millions and millions of dollars in aid per day to Vietnam. So this was the strategy: keep Vietnam bleeding, the Soviet Union bleeding. Why then solve the problem? And that didn't change until really much later. I mean, until the Gorbachev came into power in mid-1980s, and until the 1986, 87. And during that period, China had the same motive. The US and China were exactly on the same page. They supported Khmer Rouge, one of the coalitions fighting the Vietnamese occupation. Again, with the same objective of bleeding Vietnam, bleeding the Soviet Union, because the Chinese also were, this is the height of Sino-Soviet rivalry and China-Vietnam rivalry, including Chinese attack on Vietnam just after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia as a punishment to Vietnam. And when this was happening, China and the West had a similar shared concern against Vietnam and the Soviet Union. So they had very little interest in resolving this crisis. And there was only ASEAN which had a two-track strategy. On the one hand, they condemned the Vietnamese invasion with no uncertain terms in the UN Security Council, every year introducing resolutions to condemn Vietnamese invasion, calling for withdrawal. At the same time, especially countries like Indonesia, which has a history of revolutionary war of independence against colonial powers, as Vietnam did, they had more empathy for the Vietnamese. And led by Indonesia, ASEAN argued that we should also leave the door open for diplomatic settlement. And the strategy cannot be just bleeding Vietnam dry. And that will mean that the Chinese also gained in the region. So they wanted to give Vietnam a diplomatic way out, which is the basis of ASEAN's diplomacy. And that founded the diplomatic process, which then led to the Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia in 1991 and the elections in 93. So that really gave ASEAN, and also the Vietnamese withdrawal from ASEAN in September 89. So that period then ironically started with a crisis of confidence, a conflict, but build on ASEAN's confidence and international credibility. Then following that, ASEAN goes through what I call a golden age. This was the best time for ASEAN. After the end of the Cold War, Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia, well, the regional situation is good, the international situation is good, and ASEAN gained a lot of respect for its role in the diplomatic role in the Cambodia conflict. And ASEAN, everybody was talking to ASEAN. Everybody wanted to know about ASEAN. And ASEAN went through its own expansion from 6. It became, of course, it will be 1999 when the last ASEAN country, Cambodia, will join, last current ASEAN member will join in 1999. But this is the period, in 1997, ASEAN was already 9 countries, and the question of Cambodia membership was a matter of time. And this is the time when ASEAN got international credibility. ASEAN was seen as the anchor of ASEAN Asian security cooperation. This is the beginning of ASEAN centrality that we talk about. Then, of course, things changed, as things do change. Say 97 to 2008, 1997, major crisis, Asian financial crisis. Some of you would remember that. And this crisis started in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, the Baath crisis, and then, of course, spread to Indonesia. The most significant consequence of this crisis, political crisis, was the toppling of Suharto, which, again, might have been a blessing, it was a blessing in the sense that it paved the way for Indonesian democratization. And all the initial years are very tough, very unstable in Indonesia. But ASEAN suffered a major setback in 1997, politically and economically. But then through that again, it started renewing itself. In fact, as Indonesia stabilized, with especially a bit like Megawati Soekarno-Putri, but certainly under Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, Indonesia once again took a strong interest in ASEAN, and it was Indonesian leadership that had much to do with ASEAN so-called political security community, the second Bali Concord, Bali II in 2003. And so again, ASEAN renews itself very well and continues to build its idea of ASEAN centrality, including the East Asian Summit that was founded in 2005 in Malaysia, and that sort of gave ASEAN an increased international profile because it was attended by all the major powers, including at that time, initially not the United States, but certainly China and Japan, Australia, and later on India. India did join actually as a founding member, but later in the United States, under Obama also joined. Then finally, we have the revival of geopolitics. I guess it's pretty hard to find a date to it. So I might say, for the sake of continuity, 2008, but I think it's 2010-11. It's basically the rise of Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, which really took shape at one of the East Asian Summit, ARF meetings in Hanoi. I believe it's 2011. When the Chinese foreign minister told the Singapore foreign minister, China is a big country, Singapore is a small country. So remember that. And I think this was a sign of change in Chinese policy. I don't want to mean as a criticism, this is a fact. You should, this was a period of Chinese assertiveness, a major transition from the past decade when China was playing what some people call the charm offensive, trying to be nice to neighbors. And I believe genuinely it was cultivating the neighbors, increasing soft power. But this changes when China perceives that ASEAN, maybe United States get into the East Asia Summit, and China becomes more powerful, more assertive, more nationalistic. And this becomes the basis of the US-China rivalry. It actually started at that time, much before Trump and Trump's economic sanctions. And now we are going through. The global financial crisis also hit. That did not affect ASEAN because ASEAN had learned the lesson of 1997. But it did create global disruption and also distraction. In the case of, like some people thought China gained quite a bit from the 2008 crisis. It became more assertive. United States weakened after because that crisis started in the United States. And that created more of a geopolitical competition. And then I also believe we have to remember crisis of expectations. By that I mean that everybody expected too much out of ASEAN. So ASEAN centrality is a very unhelpful term to me because ASEAN is expected to manage great power rivalry involving all the major powers of the international system, including United States, China, Russia, India. I mean, ASEAN was created, as I said before, to be a very club of smaller, weaker nations for survival, to make sure they don't get dragged into great power rivalry of the type that was happening in the 60s and 70s, the US-Soviet Cold War. Now you're expecting them to manage, be a central actor, driver's seat, have the driver's seat in Asia-Pacific security. I think that created too much expectation, and ASEAN was not designed to address that, and that's one of the consequences we're facing. Of course, now we have the COVID, which has created a lot more uncertainty, but even before COVID, ASEAN was facing this twin threats of revival of geopolitics and crisis of expectations. Okay, so I am now going to move on very quickly to my last part of my presentation, so we have some time for Q&A. I don't want to go into 4 achievements of ASEAN, but just very quickly, no armed conflict have broken out among the original members of ASEAN, meaning the original 5 members. Well, you can add Brunei, which joined in the 80s, but there were conflicts between Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, but when one or both the countries were not members of ASEAN. Since ASEAN became 10, there has been one major conflict, or major in the sense of compared to others, with 100 battle deaths. That is the Thai-Cambodia pre-Vihar skirmish in 2011. But considering what happens in the developing world, global south, this is a very small blip in an otherwise very impressive record of conflict avoidance. And that to me is the basis of ASEAN's claim to be a security community, which is the title and framing of my books. Key role in the Cambodia conflict, I mentioned that. Another very important achievement is that Vietnam, which was ASEAN's security threat #1, within 5 years, since between 1989 when it withdrew from Cambodia and 1995 when it became a full member of ASEAN, a complete total transformation of relationship from being an enemy to being not only a member, but actually a leader. Vietnam is very committed to ASEAN and is leading ASEAN in many ways. then engaging all the major parts of the world. That's the fourth major achievement. ASEAN is a global organization in many ways, not just a regional organization. So it has all the major powers of the international system as its partners, dialogue partners, but also most of them come to ASEAN-related meetings every year on a regular basis. That includes not only China, US, Japan, India, Russia, European Union, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, in different ASEAN forums, either ASEAN Regional Forum or East Asia Summit or ASEAN Plus meetings, that ASEAN has individually with these great powers. So that creates a framework of engagement. And also that means ASEAN is not taking sides, playing one power against other in a way many small countries or weakest powers do. So that is the basis of ASEAN's achievements in political security arena. But what are the challenges? I think the challenges are now going to be several. One is intra-ASEAN relations. I think bilateral relations are relatively stable. Some occasional flare-up in Singapore-Malaysia relations. I don't think there is any arms race going on, really, in the real sense of the term. We do have authoritarianism, but one can be a bit cynical about it. But Southeast Asia always had authoritarianism, always had a contest between authoritarianism and democracy. It was founded as a club of authoritarian rulers. So it goes, sometimes we have reversals. We had democratization in Thailand, then reversal, and then kind of a middle level management. In Myanmar, of course, we all thought in the beginning there is some sort of a hopeful future for Myanmar, but then very soon, and even before the coup, many of us have realized that the situation is not going very well. So that kind of Southeast Asia fluctuates between democracy and authoritarianism. Don't take either for granted. Non-traditional security actually is the major challenge to ASEAN. And in fact, I find the economic crisis of '97, the environmental crisis of regular recurring forest fires, for example, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and affecting Singapore. And then, of course, COVID-19. These are very serious, if not existential, but very serious challenges to ASEAN. Great power geopolitics. I think the major development since 2014, which this latest book covers, is China has seen a decline of its soft power and trust. And this is very clear from opinion polls. But before the opinion polls, my own writing, my own interviews, I did a lot of interviews, online interviews, telephone interviews with people in Southeast Asia. I have made it very clear that China's soft power is nothing comparable to the 2000s, early 2000s, when it had the charm offensive. I believe the US has a window to reverse the Trump damage. I wrote an op-ed on this after Biden was elected. Southeast Asia was never really totally anti-US as some present, but they were disappointed with a lack of engagement. Obama engaged Southeast Asia as if it's a family, and that reflected his own childhood, spent 4 years in Indonesia as a child. And it was almost personal. But Trump almost disdained ASEAN. And you can see some pictures here. Look at Obama in 2015, East Asia Summit. And I've got very good pictures of Obama in the book as well, some other pictures, including this one. And look at Trump, very uncomfortable. And there is actually some very hilarious pictures of Trump. And he couldn't even, this traditional ASEAN handshake, he couldn't do it. He fumbled in a very symbolic way before he managed to do this. This was the 2017, the only time he actually went to an ASEAN summit in Southeast Asia. And he actually left before the East Asia Summit. He only attended the APEC Summit, which was also held in Manila. It's almost like an insult. And this is last 2019, Robert O'Brien, Trump's national security advisor, showed up in Bangkok, where he was not a cabinet minister. And this was the ASEAN-US Summit. And this was a huge diplomatic snub. Not only Trump wasn't there, but Michael Pence, the vice president, was also not there. No cabinet minister member, Pompeo, was not there. So ASEAN took it as a snub. So national security advisor, nice person, but not a summit level player. So ASEAN only sent 3 summit 3 of its leaders instead of all 10. And then the United States perceives it as a snub because ASEAN did not send 10 leaders to meet a national security advisor. So this is really very unhelpful because the United States, at least the State Department, was very hardworking in making all this, managing the relationship with ASEAN, despite the lack of interest from the White House. But I think Biden can overcome this. It makes it difficult now for Biden to go to Southeast Asia because of COVID, but also because of the Myanmar coup. He may not even attend a virtual summit of ASEAN if the Myanmar military commander is actually present. But still, in many other ways, Biden has a chance to reverse that damage. And the Indo-Pacific is another concept here that is going to have resonance on ASEAN, US relationship, ASEAN's relations with great powers, partly because this Indo-Pacific is a very, it's not an ASEAN concept to start with, except Indonesia, which has its own version of Indo-Pacific. But it is basically driven around Trump administration, Australia, Japan, and India. And one of the big elements of that strategy is the quadrilateral dialogue. And that's very much of a strategic alliance, which is also presented as a part of the Indo-Pacific concept of these 4 countries. So ASEAN is quite nervous that now here is a concept and a framing where ASEAN was not involved in creating, except the Indonesian proposal, which was much more inclusive and did not want to isolate China. Whereas the US concept and the Quad concept is very much geared towards isolating China. So this poses a threat to ASEAN's neutrality, and neutrality is key to centrality, being the honest broker. Then ASEAN, I think, still not taking sides, neither US nor China, maybe thinking about, to hell with both of you. Neither is really that credible. But at the same time, formally, it's going to keep engaging both big powers, the US and China. So there's some people in the US worry about ASEAN being pushed into choosing sides between China and the US. I really don't see that happening. What ASEAN is going to do is what it's always done, engage all, what I call co-engagement. Regional institution building, I think ASEAN itself is okay, steady, but Myanmar will pose a major challenge. I think ASEAN's larger institutions like ASEAN Regional Forum and the EAS, they're much weaker than they were in the 1990s or 2000s when they were founded. And I think ASEAN's central role for the reasons I have already described, great power geopolitics and also assertiveness of China, that's really under challenge. But there is no alternative to ASEAN. There will be no regional institution in Asia created by one big power, either US and China, that will be acceptable to the other. So if China creates its own regional institution and invites ASEAN, ASEAN will join, but US will not. If the United States wants to create Quad or whatever else, ASEAN is not going to join, and China is not going to join. Some ASEAN members may be interested, but not others. So there is no alternative to ASEAN. ASEAN as an honest broker, neutral player. So ASEAN will still remain a very key player in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. But I argue that ASEAN probably shouldn't aspire to play such a role. It's beyond its means, beyond its paycheck, so to speak. I'm sorry if this sounds a bit offensive, but ASEAN is very important to Southeast Asia. That is a very important part of the world. More than 600 million people, 3 trillion in combined GDP. So what happens in Southeast Asia, managing relations in Southeast Asia is very important contribution to global peace and security. But trying to manage the problems between US and China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, I think we're wasting our resources and attention. But that's my argument. It's been a little controversial because a lot of people want to hold on to Southeast Asia's own role. And I can sympathize with that. But I think one should be very careful about not to have high expectations about this. All right, so that was my Myanmar coup, and I want to stop here and take your questions. Thank you. All right.
Very good. Well, oh, shoot. Well, we very much look forward to your book to see the details of presentation. Just a second. Okay, now we're on. But this is a very broad-ranging talk that you've given us, Amitav, and I'm sure that there will be many questions. Let me start by asking about the effect on membership in ASEAN for the outlook and self-esteem, self-identity for the members. And the reason I ask this is that I've recently been reading a new book by Nguyen Vu Dong on Vietnam joining ASEAN in 1995. And he points out that the original attitude toward Vietnam, within Vietnam, toward ASEAN was dismissive or hostile. And then, as you point out, during the golden age of ASEAN, you have the expansion that includes Vietnam. And there was controversy within Vietnam about joining ASEAN. But since then, joining ASEAN is seen as one of the great successes of Vietnamese diplomacy. And being a member of ASEAN has become very, very important for Vietnam's sense of itself in the region, and really for the first time. And considering how split up the region was in the modern era, colonial powers of the Dutch and the French and the British, and there was very little intra-regional trade as when there were colonies, because it was trade with different mother countries. So ASEAN must have an importance not only as an entity in itself, speaking collectively, but also for the mentalities of the individual members. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. So as I said in my presentation, the transformation of ASEAN's relationship with Vietnam from being public enemy number one to valued member and partner and even leader is probably one of the most dramatic transformations in international relations in recent memory. So it's a classic example of how enemies become friends, to quote Charlie Kupchan's title of one of his books, but that's pretty much what a security community means, how enemies become friends. And this was, of course, as you might expect, there was a lot of ambiguity and misgiving within Vietnam. You have been basically sitting across the table, not sitting around the table with ASEAN. You have been hostile partners, hostile neighbors, and then suddenly, you are joining this group. But that tells you something about ASEAN and also the process. There are two reasons why this happened. First of all, there's a geopolitical reason. And Vietnam had very few diplomatic options. It's still not, was still in a hostile relationship with China. The United States was not really at that time anywhere close to Vietnam. So where do you go if you want to get out of this? The Soviet Union had collapsed, Vietnam's friend. So where do you go? So ASEAN was offering a window, a welcoming mat, so to speak. And it was consistent with ASEAN's diplomacy. ASEAN had always said that all Southeast Asian countries should be are welcome to join ASEAN, all Southeast Asian countries, including Myanmar, including Vietnam. That's from the very beginning. But provided, in the case of Vietnam, has to withdraw from Cambodia, because that's an illegal occupation of a country, violation of ASEAN's principle of non-intervention. So that's one reason. The other reason was that Vietnam was reassured by its initial meetings with ASEAN that it's actually really welcome. It can have its say. It can even lead an organization. So And ASEAN countries, for their part, were happy to have Vietnam because Vietnam brings in a little more geopolitical weight against China. It makes ASEAN a bigger entity. And so all this and makes ASEAN look normatively very appealing. So I think this is therefore why Vietnam at the moment is pleased with its membership of ASEAN. And that's what ASEAN also value of ASEAN. It doesn't demand too many sacrifices. It empowers countries. There may be also a criticism. It doesn't expect too many sacrifices or restraints. But Vietnam hasn't done anything wrong in recent years. I mean, look, the Cambodia-Vietnam relationship compared to the past is very stable. And considering the history, and that's what also reassures ASEAN members that having Vietnam is good for them, and Vietnam reassures Vietnam that being part of ASEAN is good for Vietnam.
Very good. Now let's go to some questions from the audience. And Naifa Rizani Lardo asked a question about Indonesia and Myanmar. She says, looking how Indonesia is trying to pursue an ASEAN-led initiative toward Myanmar, and considering the drawbacks and criticisms that an ASEAN-led initiative have not been effective due to constraint of the norm of non-interference, how would you see an ASEAN-led initiative that might affect a change and actually become effective?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think the issue here is that it's not like ASEAN cannot do anything. They can. I mean, in 2008, Cyclone Nargis, for a humanitarian disaster, ASEAN did play a role in providing humanitarian assistance. ASEAN already was also kind of indirectly, after a little hesitancy, involved in also humanitarian, had a humanitarian role in Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. But this is a little difficult because the Myanmar military probably felt an existential threat to its hold on power by the growing political assertiveness of NLD and also growing popularity of the NLD. So they thought they're going to lose the constitutionally guaranteed place they have in the constitution. The NLD will steer a constitutional amendment to get rid of the special privileges and representation of the military, which was probably a misunderstanding, but it didn't really, nobody clarified it. So I think now for ASEAN is going to be difficult. Indonesia itself is very interested in doing something in ASEAN. So is Singapore. So is Malaysia. Singapore actually quite clearly doesn't think non-interference should block ASEAN from doing something about Myanmar. What they can do is going to be difficult. I guess the first thing is to find a channel of some kind to the military junta, the commander in the leaders. The leader is looks like one person is leading in Myanmar. Vietnam can do that as a member of the Security Council, having historically good relations with Myanmar. But Indonesia can. They should push for some sort of a dialogue. At the same time, it's going to be difficult because people are dying. I mean, this is the difficult thing. The Myanmar military is killing people, and makes it so difficult to come back to some sort of understanding. I think ASEAN's first priority should be stop the massacres and killings, and have some sort of a channel. There have been suggestions of suspending Myanmar from ASEAN. Well, that's certainly one of the cards on the table, but my sense is that this military doesn't care. Even though Myanmar benefited from ASEAN membership economically, but this military thing, we lived with sanctions and isolation for decades. So what's new? We'll get back to it. As long as they are going to be okay because they're well provided for. The military is, as an institution, is well provided for with their own job security and protection. And so why should they care about the rest of the Myanmar population or international sanctions? Now, there are there are people in the military who have relationship with the civilian population who may not like it, but they may not be strong enough to overcome the top command. So I think ASEAN should take this up in the UN Security Council. ASEAN itself should not wait for anybody else. And Vietnam is currently a member of the Security Council, and it's going to be the chair, or is already the chair of the Security Council. This is a golden opportunity to bring it to the Security Council. At the same time, try to also do this policy of finding a way to tell the military, the leadership, not stop the killing. Well, I think I'm not guessing here. It's not my view, but I think many ASEAN countries will be okay if the military continues for a number of years pending an election, maybe 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. And this has happened before in Thailand. And, so if ASEAN can push the military towards that kind of an arrangement, and of course the NLD doesn't like it because they won the election. They have every right not to like it, okay? And I'm not saying it's wrong. The NLD to be upset that there will be a new election, when it's like telling the Democrats in the US, let's have a new election and that'll be free and fair. So I think NLD have every right to be upset, but I'm talking about ASEAN countries may be okay with a specific timetable enforced by or observed by the international community for another election in the next 2-3 years. And if that can happen, there's no good solutions here, but that's probably the best card ASEAN can play.
Very good. Now, another question we have on an intra-ASEAN question is posed by Nicole Hene from Chile. And she asks, many thanks to Professor Amitav for his talk. I would like to know what he makes of Bilahari Kausikan's recent mentioning of the possibility that Cambodia could be asked to leave ASEAN on the ground of choosing sides with China. What is the chance that ASEAN membership would shrink, and would ASEAN survive such a step?
Well, knowing Mr. Kausikan rather well when I used to work and live in Singapore, and he was the foreign secretary, I don't think he may not have said that at that time because he was making policy. I think that's very unlikely. Telling Cambodia to leave or suspending Cambodia is not going to happen. Cambodia is not going to leave, and it cannot be, I don't think it'll be easy to expel it, suspend it from ASEAN, because it is closer to China. So that's all I can say. This is unrealistic for coming from a realist, because it is true. I mean, the argument is based on the assumption, I think, the fact that Cambodia is very close to ASEAN, I'm sorry, to China. But Cambodia is never going to be totally a puppet of China. I actually happened to meet Prince Sihanouk once in the Royal Palace in 2004 or 5, 3 years, I think. And I asked him the question, why is Cambodia so close to China? And on the one hand, he used to go to China for medical treatment. And he told me that we are never going to be too close to China. China is our biggest enemy. I said, why? For somebody you actually depend on Chinese doctors for your health. He said, of course, Chinese as a neighbor, as a civilization, we respect China. But China is too big and too close. So it's always going to loom large in our sovereignty and independence. So that always, I in fact have a little gift from him behind my, an elephant he gave me, a silver elephant. And I keep it all the time in my office. But my sense is that I think ultimately Cambodia will not become a puppet, dependent state of China or any other power. So I very much regret Cambodia moving away from democracy. But I think that's not Mr. Kausikan's concern. It's not Cambodia's authoritarianism. It's Cambodia's moving close to China. Well, it's not going to happen. And in the case of Myanmar, that may become an issue. The people will start calling for expelling Myanmar. This has happened before. I mean, back in the 1990s, when Myanmar was still under military rule, I think some Malaysian leader Mahathir might have said that let's expel Myanmar. That might happen if killings go on. And that will also pose a major threat to Southeast Asia and ASEAN. In fact, Singapore is very unhappy at the moment with what's happening in Myanmar. And I am not surprised if Singapore, the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister, Balakrishnan, they would come up with, say, let's get rid of or suspend Myanmar at some point. I'm not saying that will happen now, but we'll see. But expelling a member country, suspending, is not what ASEAN does or has done in the past.
Okay, well, let's go to something else that ASEAN would be a new challenge, but toward the outside. We have a question from Professor Schappa about ASEAN's role as a neutral power broker. In the early 20th century, the Benelux countries, the Swiss, the Danes, and the Swedes all tried to play neutral broker role between France, UK, and Germany. Why should we expect ASEAN to be any more successful in using their neutrality and centrality to broker a peace between the US, China, and India?
Sure. I'll put the question a little differently. I don't think ASEAN has this policy of neutrality. So neutrality is very different. It's a legal concept in international relations from ASEAN's own policy of whatever you call it, co-engagement, even the so-called JFAN, which was official ASEAN policy, the Malaysian Kuala Lumpur Declaration in 1971 of a neutralization of Southeast Asia. That led to zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. That's not neutrality, because if you can read my book to see the extensive debate on this, the earlier books. Neutralization is a legal concept. It has to be guaranteed by international agreements, and that gives other countries kind of a space to so-called be, a broker the peace. But in this case, ASEAN doesn't believe in formal legalistic approaches. JFAN is a declaration, not a treaty. There's no JFAN treaty. It's a declaration. And like a lot of ASEAN stuff it is. And also ASEAN doesn't think it can broker a peace. It sort of wants to be a hub of multilateral interactions, which means that it has a basically convening power. So you convene an organization, invite countries to join, don't discriminate against one for the other, and create what is called comfort level. That's the term ASEAN countries use, so that everybody can come and have their say. But what they do bilaterally, ASEAN is not going to be able to control that. And so therefore, the comparison between the European brokering of peace and ASEAN's approach of engaging for peace is very different. And I'm also trying to say that ASEAN, keep your house in order. The best contribution you can make to global peace is to keep Southeast Asia stable, relationships among ASEAN countries stable, manage relations or situations like Myanmar, rather than trying to find peace between the US and China. But keep engaging them. By coming to a neutral forum, they do create ASEAN sort of meetings, like ASEAN Plus meetings, ARF, East Asia Summit, does provide opportunities for US and China to have dialogues, on separate dialogues on their own bilaterally. Those things are very useful and should be continued, but don't aspire to be a peacemaker because, as I said before, this may be well beyond the paycheck of ASEAN countries.
Very good. We have a couple of questions on ASEAN and how it relates to the Quad, especially in the resurrection of the Quad is something more significant, perhaps, in US diplomacy in the region. So let me read one of the questions from Duty Saunik. How can the Quad assuage ASEAN's potential insecurities about its ambitions for the region that may inevitably isolate China?
Yeah.
Given the Quad's combined diplomatic and military strength, can ASEAN benefit from its ability to provide stability and security without necessarily provoking conflict?
Okay, I would love to answer that. And also I want to recognize our friend John Brandon is asking a question. So could you
Yes.
please, thank you, John, for being here. But I will turn to John's question next, but let me answer the question of Quad. So Quad is, as I said, the idea of Quad did not come out of ASEAN. This is a big concept covering the entire region, including ASEAN, but the idea of Quad did not come from ASEAN. So it was Australia. Look at who is the members of Quad: US, Australia, India, and Japan. All are for ASEAN outside powers. And I want to emphasize outside powers. So that's normatively very unappealing. One of the ASEAN norms I discuss extensively in my books is regional solutions to regional problems. And the region here means Southeast Asia. And this is not a regional approach to Southeast Asian countries, certainly not to countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Of course, Southeast Asian countries want good relations with each of them, but they don't want these four to take over security management of the wider region, of which Southeast Asia is at the center, really, even geographically. Because if you bring in Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia truly becomes the center. Asia-Pacific may not be, like it's more Western-oriented. Southeast Asia is on the edge, but Indo-Pacific puts Southeast Asia in the center. Okay, that's one thing. So normatively, very unappealing. Secondly, ASEAN has its own Indo-Pacific concept, which is Indonesian leadership. It actually existed even before Quad became fashionable. So Martin Natalegawa, the former Indonesian foreign minister, had talked about Indo-Pacific, but that was a very inclusive notion. It doesn't use the American term free and open. I heard that Biden administration is moving away from free and open Indo-Pacific. But Japan still sticks to free and open. But free is a very difficult term for the Chinese to accept, because free means domestically free. And Mike Pompeo made it very clear that free and open means domestically free and also free trade and other things. That's totally known to China. And Indonesia and other ASEAN countries also don't want to aggravate China. That will be inconsistent with their approach to engaging all the powers. So let's see how Biden administration takes Indo-Pacific. It's going to stick to Indo-Pacific, but may not use the same language for free and open to define it. Now, for ASEAN, it's always going to be problematic to have other outside powers to tell them what to do about the region. It's going back to a bit of SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. I don't know if some of you remember SEATO. One of the odd things about SEATO, and this is what really got into the nerve of Nehru and Sukarno, that it placed to defend countries which are not members of SEATO. And that's what Nehru said. This is a new concept of alliance. In NATO, you are defending members of NATO that are members of NATO. In SEATO, the alliance framework said, we're going to defend the region, whether you are a member of SEATO or not. And India and others said, India at that time was a very big player in Southeast Asia, just before Bandung, 1954, when SEATO came about. They said, this is a new kind of imperialism. You are defending a region and countries who don't want to be defended. Okay, so ASEAN is going to think a little bit like that, some ASEAN countries, that it's good to have US. I'm not saying people are rejecting US presence here. That's very different. But to say that this is a framework that's going to defend all of us, in which we don't have a role, it's not going to work. At the same time, I also want to say Quad is not a military alliance. It gets too much publicity. I think it's beyond its what it's actually placed to do. If you look at Quad's engagements and Quad's activities, it's not a military. India is not going to do that kind of an alliance kind of Quad because it wants to be sensitive to China and keep an eye on China. China can put a lot of pressure on India on the border. So when Biden was elected, and around that time, I gave an interview. I said the best thing Quad should do is to distribute vaccines. That was in November. And that's what they're actually doing now. So I said, Quad should do humanitarian work, vaccine. I said, China is not the only country that can provide masks. It's not the only country that can provide vaccines. And this is November 2020, when vaccine was not been authorized. But the Americans are developing vaccine. Japan has the money to distribute. Bring in Japan, Australia, India. India is the largest vaccine manufacturers in the world. So you can do something really non-traditional security. I actually said that in an op-ed. I forget where, it might have been in PACNet. And I'm glad to see that that's what Quad is doing. That's much better money spent on human security is much more urgent, because as I said to you, the audience before, non-traditional security is far more important than traditional security to Southeast Asia, probably to everywhere, I mean, including the United States. But, and when I spent my decade in Singapore, I spent a lot of time developing a consortium on non-traditional security, even though I started as a traditional security scholar. Because you can feel it, you can see it. And this has to do with pandemics, this has to do with environmental degradation, this has to do with poverty, sheer poverty of Southeast Asia, in parts of Southeast Asia. So ASEAN is better off doing that, and Quad is better off doing that. I don't think Quad should be abolished, but it should not also be too intrusive. It's a good way to have a military coordination and exercises, but at the same time, it should not turn into an alliance that will provoke a new round of geopolitical rivalry. And that is not going to be acceptable to ASEAN.
Very good. Now, why don't we invite John Brandon from the Asia Foundation to join us.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Brantley. It's good to see you, and also you too, Amitav. I appreciate it. Basically, my question is that that Myanmar is clearly the biggest security challenge facing ASEAN right now. I think, as you said, that ASEAN is, or that Myanmar is thinking, well, we've dealt with few friends before in darker periods. This seems to be a dark period. We can do it again. But doesn't this really challenge ASEAN centrality? And if so, what if the crisis devolves into a civil war or deteriorates into a civil war? What would how will this impact ASEAN, and how will this impact broader Asian regional architecture? So thank you very much. Nice to see you both.
I think there is a real chance that it will become a civil war, at least in different parts of the country. But I think it could also affect the major cities. I think I have a feeling that the Myanmar military is surprised by the sort of depth and extent of popular protest. They might have thought that they can do and they suppress it. They might not have expected this level of anger and demonstrations. Certainly, that's what I hear through my contacts within Myanmar, although very hard to contact them these days, in the early days of the coup. As long as this kind of demonstration continues, there may be a certain amount of willingness to at least come to the table of some sort of a settlement. But again, they are not going to go back to status quo, restore the NLD government into power. I am just thinking that when I was in Myanmar during the election, I still have my hat. I actually seized it in the NLD headquarters from a guy who was going to contest the parliament. And I said, I want your hat. He said, that's my only hat. I said, too bad, give it to me. I still have a picture. And, it is so tragic. But some tragedy also happened with the way even the NLD government played with the Rohingya, which makes it difficult to see what is, to be done. So my sense is that this is going to be a major challenge for ASEAN. And this is going to be much more difficult for ASEAN to handle than a sort of more mature. This military government is new, and they have some memory, but they're not in the stage like in 2007, 2008, before the 2011, 2010 elections, the sort of liberalization. They haven't seen the consequence of this in terms of what it can do to the country. So when I went to Myanmar in 2010-11 and did meet with the President Thein Sein and others, I think that my distinct sense was that they had looked around. They had looked around Laos, Cambodia. Everybody is doing better than Myanmar. And I said, why can't we do such a thing? So they were actually themselves fed up with the poverty and the stagnation of Myanmar. In this case, this military still is probably going to live off the recent economic boom. They might have collected tons of money from the last decade or so of building boom investments. So to make them come to kind of economic situation where they feel they have nowhere to go, but have to make some compromises, going to take time, which is very sad. In the meantime, they have their own friends and see what China is going to do. So I'm afraid that you are right. I want us to be very pessimistic about how the situation is going to go. And it's going to undermine ASEAN. That's why I say ASEAN should get very quickly, at least be, on the record saying that stop the killings. And I think, as I said earlier, ASEAN's approach could be to have a timetable for new elections. I don't think they would press for restoring the status quo like NLD government, which will be actually good in many ways, but that's not going to be acceptable to military in Myanmar. So that's basically where we are at the moment. But in the meantime, it's not just ASEAN, it's the international community. Where else you see people, 500 people, God knows how many children dying from bullets from the military these days in the world when we are also going through COVID. So the UN Security Council should do that something. It's not just a regional responsibility, it's a global responsibility. And I think there should be concerted action. And it should not be left only to the Western countries. It should be a priority for ASEAN itself and other Asian countries.
Thank you.
That's great. Let me ask a couple of questions inspired by this virtual formatting of a Zoom meeting. Since we're in many locations at once, and ask you, if you were in Beijing right now, what would you recommend to Beijing about effective strategy toward Southeast Asia? What should they stop doing? What should they continue doing? And then my second question is going to be the same question closer to home for you, and that is, what should Washington be doing?
Well, it is such a hypothetical question, so much beyond my pay grade to advise Beijing. So I would, first thing I would say that use all your direct, indirect, open, closed, covert, overt channel of communication to stop shooting at people in Myanmar and the people dying on the street, because that not only makes ASEAN look bad, but everybody looks bad, including China, because you are supposed to have some clout, you have investments, you have some leverage. Now, I'm aware that the Myanmar military also is unhappy about China, partly because Aung San Suu Kyi was supposed to be moving closer to China. And the China card can be used as a political weapon. Demonstrations against China and Chinese investment could be a way to mobilize nationalist sentiments on both sides, from the NLD side and from the military side. So China has to be careful. But not doing something where you have the leverage is not going to make China look good. And this whole idea that China doesn't interfere has never been credible to me. China always interferes when it wants to. But there are ways of interfering. I mean, you can do that directly or indirectly, but telling a country, military or leaders not to kill their own people is not interference. That's that's a contribution to humanity. If you want to be a leader of the 21st century, you want to have a global governance leadership, you have a responsibility. You're a member of the Security Council. You have to stop this. I make a distinction between human rights and democracy. Not all democracies are good at protecting human rights. So I care less about democracy, but I do care a lot about human rights. And human rights, this sort of violation should not be acceptable to any civilized country. And if you are in a position to do something, you should do it. That will be my first advice. The rest would be to say, do whatever you like, but look for work with ASEAN to find a solution. Whatever it may be, as I said, it's not going to be acceptable to NLD to have a new elections. So they won the election. They think fair and square, so they should be restored to power. But that may not be acceptable to the military. So maybe some middle ground here with a very specific timetable for a new elections, or maybe somewhere in between. One can think creatively about it, and China can help with that. Those are the two things I'll say about Myanmar. About the rest of the region, there are many things China can do. I mean, China, as you probably know, China's soft power has declined. So the latest opinion poll from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, that I actually have it in my book. I have it in the PowerPoint. I didn't have time. China is seen as the least trustworthy among the major powers in the region. This is an elite opinion survey, but it does talk to the reality. That was my understanding, looking at interviewing people well before this opinion poll came out in January. So China's trust deficit has gone down. People don't trust China to do the right thing in international affairs, in global governance. And if you are so unpopular in your own neighborhood, how can you expect to be a global player? So I think if you're sensible, think of long term, you should think about why is China losing its soft power. It had tremendous soft power in the 2000s. So what happened? So that's what I will tell the Chinese about. For the Americans, no time to lose. Reverse the diplomatic disengagement that we find during the Trump administration. The United States has a lot to offer. So I think re-engagement will be very important, but at the same time, be sensitive to ASEAN's concern. So again, one of the problem areas is going to be the Quad. Pushing Quad too much is going to make some ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, unhappy. So it will be really good if the Biden administration can talk to Indonesia about how to, operationalize its security strategy and not use the Quad as the defining sort of element. You can say that Quad is for a larger region, ASEAN is Southeast Asia, but the two things are going to be linked. And I think the public health diplomacy, vaccines and all are also going to be very important. And my last point, I think John Brandon will know this. We have been talking about this in all the meetings that our ASEAN Center organizes at American University. Don't see relations with Southeast Asia from the prism of US-China relations.
Right.
A lot of people in Washington are used to thinking of Southeast Asia as sort of a child show. So Southeast Asia is like a playground for US-China rivalry. So you pull them in and you push them out of Chinese orbit. So American policy towards Southeast Asia is often driven by its policy towards China. So Southeast Asia, if we don't do this, China will take over. Or you should do this only because China should take over. So I think it's important to treat Southeast Asia on its own terms. And that's a thing that Americans have not been able to do very well historically, not just Trump. And it's important that we don't go back to that during the Biden administration.
Amitav, with those wise words, I think we should conclude this very interesting and very wide-ranging and stimulating discussion of Southeast Asia. And I hope everyone in the audience has not only benefited from it, but will be encouraged to read your book when it's available at the end of the month, presumably, and also to take Southeast Asia seriously respect Southeast Asia as a region and ASEAN as an organization because of the contributions that both have already made to world peace, and also to the fact that any interference that's not based on respect of the region is likely to lead to uncertainties and instabilities. So thank you very much, Amitav, for your contributions.
Thank you very much for having me. Good luck, everybody.
Okay.
Nice to see you
We end
both.
the meeting now. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, Amitav.
Right. So what do we do? Recording stopped?
Yeah, and we didn't get to all the questions, but most of the questions that we didn't get to had some links to what has already been covered. So
yeah, well, we do have 30 minutes, 40 minutes for Q&A.